Today you're going to find out how France influences Africa and whether it influences it at all. How are they connected if there are no colonies anymore? Why do some African countries still hate France? And most importantly, what does influence look like in the 21st century? And here the main thing is to make it clear. Africa is huge, and we're talking about Francophone West and Central Africa, plus a few key points like Djibouti. Let's start with the controversial topic of the CFA franc. Why is it controversial? Because currency is always a question of sovereignty. The first fact that matters, the CFA franc isn't one currency, it's two zones. There's the West African zone, often labeled XOF, and the Central African zone, XAF. And they share the same principle, a fixed peg to the euro. The official fixed rate is often cited as €1 equals 655.957 CFA. What does it mean when a currency is fixed to the euro? First of all, it gives stability. It's easier to plan imports, easier to keep prices predictable, fewer currency swings. That benefits importers and appeals to people who fear inflation. But there's a downside. When you have a fixed peg, you have less freedom to use the exchange rate as a tool. For example, if a country needs to support exports or absorb an external shock more smoothly. That's why the CFA topic always triggers debate. Some say stability is good. Others say we pay a high price for that stability. Because currency isn't just money in your wallet. It's the speed at which the state can react to a crisis. Sometimes a country has a problem but lacks the levers to quickly adjust monetary policy. And then it has to solve everything through the budget, debt, and external loans, which is slower and politically harder. In analyses of the CFA system, there's a mechanism described as historical monetary cooperation with France, including the role of convertibility guarantees. When your finances are tied to an external guarantor, that itself is an element of influence, even if it provides stability. The second fact is military presence and security. You've probably heard in the news that France is leaving Africa, but the situation is a bit more complicated. Yes, since 2022, France has indeed been reducing its military presence in a number of West African countries, and this became part of a broader troop withdrawal. Reuters also wrote that Paris's overall regional plan envisioned reducing forces from roughly 2,200 to 600 troops. For example, in Mali in February 2022, France announced it would withdraw its troops. This involved about 2,400 French soldiers. The full withdrawal was completed on August 15, 2022. So the reduction was effectively from approximately 2,400 to zero. Burkina Faso. After the military agreement was terminated, France withdrew about 400 special forces from Task Force Sabre. The official end of operations was announced in February 2023, meaning the reduction was from approximately 400 to zero. And in Côte d'Ivoire, at the end of 2024, a withdrawal of French forces was announced, and in February 2025, France handed over its base in Abidjan and said it would leave only 80 troops mainly for training. So the reduction there went roughly from 600 to 80. But military influence isn't only about how many bases you have open or how many soldiers are stationed there. It's also about who trains the army, what agreements are signed, who supplies equipment, and who provides intelligence. For example, as of 2025, Djibouti remains the only fully permanent French base on the continent, with a contingent of about 1,500 troops. And France did in fact withdraw its troops from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Senegal. In June 2025, there was the final handover of a major facility in Senegal. A bit of historical context. In 2014 to 2022, France ran a major operation in the Sahel, Operation Barkhane, presenting it as a fight against jihadist groups. But what happened there that made it a political failure for France? France's official motive was to prevent jihadist groups from entrenching themselves, to support the armies of the G5 Sahel countries, and to prevent the region from becoming a major platform for terrorism and cross-border crime. French official statements directly link the operation to threats against Sahel states, the risk of Mali collapsing, and the fact that the intervention happened at the request of a sovereign state, and ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. Paris also linked the Sahel to a broader threat: trafficking in weapons, people, and drugs, which armed groups were feeding on. The Sahel is a broad, semi-arid belt of Africa just south of the Sahara. Simply put, it's a transition zone between the Sahara Desert in the north and the wetter savannas in the south. When the news talks about the Sahel, they most often mean countries like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mauritania. The UN also often highlights these 5 countries as the core of the Sahel, although in a broader sense, the region can include more countries. Back to France. Besides the official motives, there were unofficial ones as well. ISS Africa analysts back in 2014 wrote that Barkhane was not only a counterterrorism mission, but also a way to preserve France's political, military, and strategic influence in the zone of its former colonies. In other words, fighting terrorism was a real task, but the operation also reinforced Paris's role as the main external security player in the Sahel. Barkhane gave France tactical successes. French forces regularly destroyed militant convoys, supported local armies, gathered intelligence, carried out airstrikes, and eliminated notable commanders. But the problem is that military successes did not translate into political stabilization in the region. Barkhane gave France tactical successes. French forces regularly destroyed militant convoys, supported local armies, gathered intelligence, carried out airstrikes, and eliminated notable commanders. But the problem is that military successes did not translate into political stabilization in the region. By 2021, Macron himself publicly acknowledged that a permanent external military presence cannot replace the return of the state, public services, and political stability. In 2021, Crisis Group wrote that the France-led strategy was failing amid rising jihadist activity, intercommunal violence, and declining trust in the state. ISS Africa put it even more bluntly: radicalization can't be stopped by military force alone. And here France hit a dead end. It could kill commanders and disrupt militant operations, but it couldn't build a functioning state in Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger. On the ground, the same problems remained: weak armies, corruption, conflicts between communities, lack of administration in the provinces, poverty, smuggling, and a legitimacy crisis for the authorities. As a result, violence didn't disappear. It spread across the region. ACLED recorded that by 2021 to 2022, Burkina Faso had become the epicenter of the conflict, and 2022 was on track to become the deadliest year for Burkina and Mali. In the first half of 2022, more civilians were killed in the Central Sahel than in all of 2021. Another result of Barkhane was the rise of anti-French sentiment. The longer the operation lasted, the more a portion of society in Mali, Burkina Faso, and later Niger began to see the French presence not as protection, but as a symbol of external control and neo-colonial dependence. Reuters and Crisis Group directly connected the harsh anti-French rhetoric of recent years to accumulated frustration with years of foreign military presence, especially since security for ordinary people often didn't improve. And the ending of this whole story came not because terrorism was defeated, but because the political foundation of the mission collapsed. After coups and worsening relations with Mali's authorities, France and its European allies said in February 2022 that because of the actions of Mali's transitional authorities, the political, operational, and legal conditions for continuing the mission were no longer in place. In September 2022, Macron said they had to leave Mali because the political framework no longer existed. And on November 9, 2022, he officially announced the end of Barkhane, adding that France would not stay in such external operations without a time limit. What did this operation lead to? France tried to shift from a large standalone operation to a lighter model: what we discussed: training, support, intelligence, partnership with local armies. But soon this model began to collapse too. After Mali, the French were pushed out of Burkina Faso and Niger. Reuters wrote in 2023 that after France left Mali and Burkina Faso, violence increased, and the withdrawal from Niger left a hole in the West's counterterrorism architecture in the region. At the same time, Russian influence increased, especially through Wagner's presence in Mali. So we understand that France completed troop withdrawals from Niger, Senegal, and Burkina Faso. but it still maintains military presence in certain locations, for example in Djibouti and Gabon. An important point: if France leaves, the space doesn't stay empty. Others move in: the US, China, Turkey, Russia, and the Gulf states. And that turns Africa not into someone's colony, but into a field of competing influences. The third fact is political networks in France-Afrique. There's a term that often comes up, France-Afrique. People interpret it differently, but in the simplest sense, it's the idea that after formal independence, informal ties remained in some countries between political elites, business, and French institutions. How does it work in practice? Very simply, where did they study? Who are they friends with? Who got contacts? Who has connections? Influence is often strongest where it doesn't look like influence. If you have a minister who studied in the French system, speaks French, and works with French advisors, they don't need pressure, they're already inside the system. You've probably noticed that when you're in another country and you hear only a foreign language, after 5 days you start thinking differently. Now imagine an entire country speaking a foreign language for decades, a language that became almost native. How do you think they will think and reason? But it's important to note that recently there has been a trend towards sovereignty, and anti-French rhetoric has become part of political capital. That's why we see agreements being broken and military presence shrinking. It's not only about the army, it's about a political symbol. The fourth lever of influence: business and infrastructure. When people talk about France's influence, they often picture military bases. But sometimes what works more strongly isn't bases. It's contracts, ports, railroads, energy, extraction, infrastructure. Because whoever controls infrastructure or key services can influence the economy more than 1,000 soldiers. For example, in Senegal, roads and urban transport. The French company Eiffage received a contract from the government of Senegal to finance, design, build, operate, and maintain the first section of the Dakar-Diamniadio highway. The company itself calls this project the first PPP in sub-Saharan Africa and the first toll highway in West Africa. In Côte d'Ivoire, the port of Abidjan. Abidjan's first container terminal was historically managed via Abidjan Terminal, where Bolloré Africa Logistics held 51% and APM Terminals held 49%. For accuracy, today this is no longer a Bolloré asset, because the former Bolloré Africa Logistics was sold and now operates under the AGL brand within MSC, but the original entry into this strategic node was French. Cameroon, railways and logistics. Camrail, linked to the former French logistics group Bolloré/AGL, has been the concessionaire of Cameroon's railways since 1999. If you want, in the next videos we can break down in more detail how exactly, and through which companies, France invested in African countries and what that led to. Write in the comments. Historically, French companies held strong positions in a number of sectors in Francophone countries. This created economic interdependence: jobs, taxes, contracts, political deals. France operated through this scheme: money, infrastructure, dependence, political influence. In many countries, the main question isn't, are there foreign companies? But who controls the strategic nodes: the port, the power grid, communications, transport? Because in a crisis, those nodes determine who holds on. The fifth lever is language, education, and culture. Earlier, we discussed something like France-Afrique. The French language is not only a cultural trace, it's a tool for education, government administration, diplomacy, and media. If a country's elite and bureaucracy operate in French, it changes everything. Which universities are considered prestigious? Which media outlets influence people? Which models of law and administration are seen as the norm? Language is like an operating system. It determines which apps are easiest to run, what books you read, what media you follow, and who you build career networks with. And here you can't label it as good or bad. It's simply a mechanism that gives France long-term cultural presence, even when soldiers are gone. Now let's sum it up. Why is France's influence weakening, or is it simply changing? Influence rarely disappears instantly. It simply changes form. Military presence can shrink, but cultural and economic influence remains. The financial axis can become a subject of reforms, but habits and institutions remain. Elite networks may crack, But connections in education, business, and diplomacy keep working. Today, many African countries play the game differently. China offers infrastructure and loans. Turkey expands trade and soft power. The US and the EU play through security and investments. And local elites often use this competition to negotiate better terms. So how does France still influence Africa? First, finances and currency architecture, including the CFA system and questions of sovereignty. Second, security and military agreements, which are actively changing right now. Third, economic and infrastructure interests, contracts, logistics, investments. Fourth, language and culture, the longest-lasting lever of influence.